It is one of Scotland's most controversial murder convictions, and 47 years on, the alleged miscarriage of justice is not going away. In 1973, George Beattie was sent to prison for the stabbing to death of Margaret McLaughlin in woods near Carluke. He's always maintained his innocence, but has so far failed in legal attempts to clear his name. Now, in a startling new development, the fiancé of the victim has backed Beattie's fight, saying he's an innocent man who was fitted up by the police. Bob Alexander broke his long silence in a special investigation by STV's chief reporter, Sharon Frew.
In the reports of this murder over the decades, there has only ever been one black and white image of Margaret McLaughlin. These treasured photographs belong to the man Margaret was going to marry.
She was exceptionally thoughtful and honest. Really, everybody appreciated it. And so, after a very short time, she fitted in very closely with our family. And I hopefully fitted in well with their family.
Here, the young bride-to-be beams for the camera. This was at a leaving party for Bob before he headed to start a job in Johannesburg. The couple had been planning a new life in South Africa. 3 months before their October wedding, news came from Scotland that shattered those dreams.
A journalist who worked for a UK newspaper actually came to my office on the Monday, and he was shocked that I was sitting there and really just, I didn't know why he was there. He asked me first if I was Bob Alexander, my fiancée was Margaret McLaughlin. Then he told me that she'd been murdered. You're a bit numb. You don't really think. I mean, it was why and who could have done this, because she was such a friendly personality. Carluke itself, nothing really happened in Carluke.
This Lanarkshire town found itself on the front pages after the brutal events of the 6th of July 1973. On that rainy evening, Margaret McLaughlin left her family home to meet Bob's sister in Glasgow. The walk to the railway station through an area known as Colonel's Glen should only have taken a few minutes, but Margaret never made it to the train. The next morning, her body was discovered in the woods. 6 days later, 19-year-old George Beattie was charged with her murder.
I would have thought it'd be about 5 o'clock in the morning. I heard this most awful scream, and it was my mother. And the police had arrived at the house to say that George had confessed to the murder of Margaret McLaughlin. And all I could hear her saying was, "Oh no, oh no, he didn't do it. He never did that. He has not confessed." She knew that there was no way that he had ever done anything like that. My mother spent her life trying to prove his innocence. It just got too much for my dad, and he just took a heart attack and died 2 years later.
No, I did not commit that murder.
George Beattie was given a life sentence and spent 15 years in prison. Appeal judges twice rejected his claims of a miscarriage of justice. The Crown case against Beattie depended heavily on his special knowledge of the crime scene, which police said could only be known to Margaret's killer. The trial was told of a confession in which Beattie stated men wearing top hats with mirrors on them had forced him to watch the attack.
To me, it was a complete stitch-up. And half the interview I can't recall. I can remember them slapping things down on tables and banging my head on top of them. The way I was treated with the Lanarkshire police at that time, the time that the interviews went through and that, the time they finished me, I would say I was punch drunk, because they used towels around the hands.
How does somebody who repeatedly stabs their victim escape?
Criminologist Professor David Wilson grew up in Carluke. He is convinced of George Beattie's innocence, and he set about examining who could have been responsible for Margaret's murder.
This is so intimate. Anybody could have been looking out of their back windows.
Margaret was stabbed 19 times. There were no witnesses to the attack.
There is no forensic evidence to connect George Beattie to this murder. A killer who has just engaged in overkill, he repeatedly stabs his victim, is going to be disinhibited, is not only going to be covered in physical evidence, psychologically he's going to be exhibiting a great deal of unusual behaviours. Nobody who saw George Beattie ever said that George Beattie was behaving out of the ordinary. So you could rule George Beattie quite quickly out of this investigation.
There is no way he could ever have done that. He wasn't the type of, if he saw somebody fighting in the street, he would cross to the other side of the road because he wouldn't want to be involved. He wasn't an aggressive person in any way.
In 1973, there was no such thing as CCTV, offender profiling, mobile phone records, and forensic science was still in its infancy.
I've suggested a more likely suspect for who killed Margaret lives in these houses. And the door-to-door inquiries that were undertaken by the police at the time did uncover somebody who was extraordinary, in the words of the two detectives who interviewed him at the time, who they felt should have been ruled out of the investigation.
One of those detectives now runs an antique shop. In 1973, Bob Beveridge was with the Scottish Crime Squad. He and his colleagues carried out door-to-door inquiries in Unitas Crescent. They spoke to people living in the homes which overlooked the area where Margaret was murdered.
We came across this young man who was acting, I would say, his behaviour was certainly not normal. He alleged that he too was a victim, and he said, I've got a couple of stab wounds, and he did show us, and he had superficial wounds on his front here. We then reported back that this bloke might be a person of interest. Take him up to the old police station, sit with him all night and see what he says. He might just come out with something of interest. Well, he came out with plenty of things of an incriminating nature. He did come away with the fact that he quite enjoyed stabbing cats. I sat with him through the night, and it was about 9 in the morning. I knocked on the door, a uniformed police constable said, just let him go. That was it, just let him go.
The detectives were then told George Beattie had been charged with Margaret's murder. After months of research, Professor Wilson tracked down the man he believed had sat with police officers that night. Previously, he named him as John Smith in his book.
The man that I think is a more likely suspect is Les Jardine. I gave my research to Police Scotland, and then they confirmed that Les Jardine had died in May of this year. I can't prove questions of guilt or innocence. I can only say that it is quite clear George Beattie did not commit this murder, and that there was a more likely suspect who was even identified at the time.
Bob recalls how he was visiting the murder scene with Margaret's distraught relatives when he was asked to meet with the man in charge of the investigation. Detective Chief Superintendent William Munsey, the then head of Lanarkshire CID, had an impressive reputation. He'd investigated 53 killings with a 100% conviction rate. This was his 54th and final case before his promotion.
I'd assumed that I was going to the local police station. In fact, where I was taken was into a pub. William Munsey was drinking at the bar with some of his colleagues. And after a brief discussion, which was less than a minute with him, I came away with the impression that William Munsey was such an arrogant, pompous individual. He was actually saying he would actually have this case resolved in a very short time. We were told that there was quite compelling evidence, so you accept that.
I'm not going to be too critical of the police not getting it right, as it were. I'm going to be critical of the police in terms of having confirmation bias, of Munsey just having such tunnel vision that he would rule out evidence that exonerated George Beattie at the time and seem to build a case so as to fit George Beattie up.
The whole conduct of the inquiry would never be accepted today. It was lackadaisical. That lad that we had should have been put through the mill a wee bit by more senior officers and more experienced people who interviewed and interrogated prisoners to see what was happening there at all, because there's no doubt about it that his comments really should have demanded further investigation instead of just the door opening in the morning.
It was rumoured Les Jardine had been living in Canada. He is known to have spent time in a Lanarkshire psychiatric hospital. Professor Wilson did track him down, and when they met, Jardine denied murdering Margaret.
He denied this absolutely, but then so much of what he said to me seemed illogical, seemed inconsistent, and quite clearly he wasn't very keen to speak to me, and the interview that I had with him lasted no longer than 10 minutes. But enough was said in that 10 minutes to make me again feel here was a much more likely suspect that needed to be ruled out by Police Scotland under caution. And of course they can't do that now.
Is it all too late now?
It's never too late.
Should the case be reopened?
Without a doubt.
Both Police Scotland and the Crown Office say they will consider any new information. The next step would be to present evidence to the Scottish Criminal Cases Review Commission. The Beattie family believe this is the last chance to mount a fresh appeal.
Nobody ever came and knocked on the door and said, I don't believe your son did this. Nobody ever came and gave us any support. We just got nasty letters. We just got the windows smashed. It was awful.
When cases get back to the appeal court, I have to say more often than not, appeals are refused. But I see George Beattie as one of those cases that it won't go away, and even if, God forbid, George were not to be with us any longer, I still think it wouldn't go away. But look what's happened with the McGrahy case. It's one of these cases where there's a number of features which are parts of classic miscarriages of justice. They've all come together, but now with a fresh impetus from David Wilson's book, hopefully the whole thing will be looked at properly again.
Bob has remained in contact with Margaret's family. They have never publicly commented on claims this case was a miscarriage of justice.
They still feel real pain regarding it. I mean, I obviously think about it a lot, but they probably more so than me, and they would really like this just to disappear, because their view is this won't bring Margaret back. But it doesn't get away from the fact that there's an innocent man has had his life ruined by this.
I feel that there's no much time left now. My mother died, and I would like to have her to see me cleared, but that wasn't to be.
His life, even though he's out of prison, has never been his own. For him just be able to live and breathe and think, at last my innocence has been proved.
So I accept as a kind of existential legal problem there is no case to reopen, but a mature criminal justice system, which the Scottish system is, a mature Scottish criminal justice system, has to be able to put its hand up and admit it got it wrong.
Sharon Frew reporting. We're staying with the theme of miscarriages of justice for our weekly Ponsonby Perspective. Tonight, Bernard argues that although the legal system gets it right most of the time in terms of guilt and innocence, justice is not the prime function of courts.
Imprisoning a person for a crime they did not commit is one of the most serious acts a state can perpetrate against a citizen. As the George Beattie case demonstrate, the wheels of justice don't turn slowly. In some cases, they don't turn at all. In Britain, the cases of the Birmingham 6 and the Guildford 4 were forged in corruption by the state, by police officers and the prosecution system.
The police told us from the start that they knew we hadn't done it. They told us they didn't care who done it. They told us that we were selected and that they were going to frame us.
In 1999, Scotland followed England's example with the creation of a Criminal Cases Review Commission. The first ever murder case that body sent to the appeal court was that of Stuart Mitchell Gare.
Did you murder Peter Dewar Smith?
No.
I presented 2 documentaries seeking to prove Gare was innocent of the murder in a Glasgow lane of fellow Stirlingshire man Peter Smith. 3 witnesses admitted they gave perjured evidence. 2 alibi witnesses said he couldn't have committed the killing. There was no forensics against him. Gare spent 13 years in jail before his murder conviction was eventually quashed. The system went above and beyond to maintain his guilt. I learned a number of key lessons from the case. 1. The court system tests evidence against charges to establish guilt or innocence. That might or might not lead to a just conclusion. Justice is not the prime function of courts. Second, the idea that all police are whiter than white is a joke of a distinctly sick variety. Look at the history of miscarriage cases and you can chart a parallel narrative of police corruption. And justice is not always the end game. Stuart Gare got his freedom, but it proved to be short-lived. On the eve of a payout for the years he spent incarcerated, he died of a heart attack at the age of 44.